So just to make sure everybody is in the right workshop and we won't be offended if you stand up and leave and want to go hear about methane, or I think there was a connectedness one. This one is around New Zealand's future sheep. So just as a bit of an overview of the workshop, 10 minutes just giving us a bit of background and scene setting, and then a section where we're going to be considering the traits. We've got quite a few traits to get through because our future is quite complex. We're going to try and keep to about 3 minutes per trait group, but everybody's got note pages in front of them. Please write down things. If you agree with what we're saying, if you don't agree with what we're saying and we're missing a trait that we need to be thinking about, and I'm sure we have forgotten some, please just note them down. We will be trying to get engagement on those slides, but then at the end, a little bit of general discussion about what we are missing, but also the chance, we're going to have a little bit of there's some stickies coming around at some stage. We've got some pages that will be out on the tables that kind of are summarising the traits, and for you to go through and star what ones you actually think are most important, so that we can kind of accumulate what is an audience as breeders, as commercial farmers, as the future of our industry, where we see the importance being. So on to some of the scene setting. We need to think about where the New Zealand industry, sheep industry, has been to get us to the point that we're in. We've traditionally farmed within a temperate climate. There has been semi-arid in some areas, and that's been the home of merinos traditionally. Our genetic base of those non-merino flocks has predominantly been from UK-derived breeds, and our genetic selection for a number of decades really focused on production traits such as more lambs born and more growth. But we've also considered the traits that we've traditionally been paid on in terms of weight of wool, the micron, the colour of that fleece, and the weight of the carcass. And it's traditionally been considered that the leaner, the better. However, we've done all of this, and we've heard Sam and Jason talk about the kind of interaction between genetics and management, is that we have had a real heavy reliance on chemical inputs to be able to achieve some of these production outcomes that we've had to this point, whether it's drenches to be able to get our lambs growing faster, or the use of zinc within our facial eczema systems. It comes as no surprise to any of us in the audience, though, there are massive headwinds ahead of us when we think about the future of our industry. This slide was actually put together a couple of years ago when times were good. I should probably have economic challenges in bold on this slide now. We have economic challenges in terms of the input costs that we have, but also the relative value of our different wool products, e.g. wool. We have our environmental challenges, greenhouse gases, and the changing climate, which I'll expand on the next slide. We also have cultural and social challenges around the regulations of how we farm and consumer expectations around the quality of the products that they are purchasing. We also have significant toolbox challenges. On the previous slide, I talked about our heavy reliance on chemical inputs. We're now in the situation where triple drench resistance is a common thing on farms, unfortunately. We also have the situation where zinc as a prophylactic treatment in the European Union is being outlawed. It's been traditionally used there in piglets. And so there are a whole lot of areas where how we've been versus where we are going to the future need to be different. One of the key things we need to think about is the changing climate. Anybody who has heard me speak for a number of years at the forum when I've done facial eczema presentations, this is the demeanour map. On the left is traditionally where facial eczema has been considered an issue, but on the right is the area that is considered to be an issue if we had several degrees climate change or climate warming. 2016, apart from North Canterbury, and Otago, 2016, when it was a really bad FE year, that map was accurate. When we start thinking about what a changing climate is going to be, is we need to think about adaptation. We have a subtropical environment increasingly in Northland. Some of the tropical fruits that they are now producing is testament to that. But climate change means that the prediction is that subtropical weather is going to be moving south into areas like the Waikato and further south. What we have traditionally considered as arid areas are potentially going to be increasingly temperate, which brings its own challenges. We're potentially going to be seeing changes in pasture types. like C4 grasses. We need to have animals that are resilient to these changes in their environment. One area is heat stress, and then we also need to consider the increased disease risks, whether it's facial eczema, internal parasites, and external parasites. When we also think about climate change, we have that ability to use them as a mitigation tool as well within our production systems. Sheep generally have a smaller environmental footprint compared to cattle. I think everybody still wants to have cattle, but sheep definitely do have that as a benefit to them. And then the methane, which is being discussed more in Suzanne's presentation, and we will touch on it slightly later. But so we're here as a room of geneticists, and so what we need to think about is the role that genetic improvement has and where the sheep industry needs to go. Genetics is an environmentally and ethically appropriate way to address many of these headwinds and challenges that we have. It can be cumulative as selection pressure is maintained and there are no negative antagonisms with other traits. Genetic variation exists for all traits that address where we need to go, some more than others. But we do recognise that the more traits that are selected on, the more genetic progress in an individual trait can be diluted. But we increasingly can't ignore some of these traits. But what are these traits? We'll go through them in more detail, but just as a scene setter and to get you thinking, we have things like increased incidences of pneumonia. We have our traditional production traits, short tails, bare points, methane emissions, heat tolerance, feed efficiency, carcass traits, meat quality traits, and things like immune competence. So how to know how to get to where we need to go? We know that some of the physical traits, like short tails and bare points, are under strong genetic control and are often breed-linked. There are, however, some of these traits that are really new to us internationally, but particularly in New Zealand. So things like heat tolerance in sheep. We could import breeds that have kind of had a Middle Eastern upbringing, but that is more an arid environment versus the subtropical conditions that we're likely to be facing. We need science-based evaluation of minority and new breeds. Traditionally, any breeds that would come into New Zealand back in the 70s and 80s and 90s would kind of go through a very thorough research-based assessment of the genetic merit of those breeds before they were introduced into the industry. We now have the ability to introduce any genetics that we can get our hands on that has not been proven or tested in a New Zealand environment. And so we need to make sure that we're not sending our industry backwards with some of the decisions that are made. We need potentially, and this is a little bit controversial, but potentially gene editing. The short fin tail. What if we could put that immediately into some of our long-tailed breeds? That would be a game changer to how we can go about not requiring docking and potentially DAGs. So we need to be considering some of these new composite breeds. We can base them on New Zealand breeds that already have traits like FE tolerance, so potentially starting with a Romney, Cootworth or Perrindale base. We can start using minority breeds that are already in New Zealand, and there is already a lot of the use of the Wiltshire. But we can also consider, and it was touched on a little bit with Jason and Sam earlier, around the importation of novel breeds outside of those kind of composites from the UK. Something very transformational would be the likes of the Katahdin from the States, which has that subtropical adaptation and a really strong emphasis on parasite tolerance. And what we need to do at the same time as all of this is we need to have demonstration flocks to show the changes and benefits that can come with some of these changes in our breeding programs so that we can address the reluctance to change within our commercial farmers. An example of one of these initiatives is, and Natalie?
So the SFFF Sheep of the Future program, it was officially started last year, but it was actually started in 2010. I think the culprits that started it have left the room, but it came out with the discussions with industry and AgResearch, Landcorp, Pamu. What is the next, horizon thingies? We've got our strong wool, but how do we decide if we want to go no wool or do we need to fine up wool? And so there was talking with AgResearch, they just done their white paper on some of the sheep of the future stuff as well. And we thought, well, we need a 2 trial sites. One for looking at no wool, so we did that at Kapiro. It's in Kerikeri. It's already got the kikuyu grasses in a subtropical environment to really test them. What we've done up there is that we've tried to find all of the hair or shedding breeds that people have been importing or already in New Zealand and try them up there, do specific breed crosses and pretty much measure them for everything that we could under the sun plus. And we'll go through some of those in the next slides. So we've done the Dorpers, the Wiltshires, the Exlanas, the low footprints, the, what else is the Meat Masters, the Damaras. That was fun, the Damaras. No offence to anybody that likes the Damara, sorry. Then, yeah, so some of all the new imports that have been done recently, we tried to capture them as well. And then the finer wool one, it started off at Aotearoa in Taupo, but we've just shifted it down to Thornycroft just out of Dunedin. And there we looked at integrating the merinos, and some people might think we're just reinventing the wheel there, and in respect we sort of are, but we also wanted to try and make sure that we could compare them to the strong wool on this beef and lamb genetics and the SIL stuff and measure them for a whole lot of traits as well and get all the genotyping and research done behind it, and then hopefully share that and get everybody involved. We've been working closely with quite a lot of breeders in both spaces, and we've been really lucky with what they've given us in terms of their time and experience and the genetics, and we hope to be able to get that all back to them as well with all the stuff that we're going to start talking about.
So this is where we will become a little bit interactive. As I said, we've only got about 3 minutes per slide. We'll see how we go, whether it's interactive of hands up of what's most important, or per topic if you think there's a trait under those that we're missing. But effectively we've got about 7 or 8 slides of the traits that we are considering, both within AgResearch with some initiatives we're doing with other breeders, but definitely with Natalie and the Future Sheep program that she has running. I want to start off though by that slide saying that production and product quality are still important. We need to have that at the forefront of our minds when we're actually embarking on any of these new production systems, because this is what makes us money. I think there was a question earlier today around what feedback is coming from the post-farm gate in terms of our breeding decisions, and meat quality and things like intramuscular fat that you'll be hearing about later on today are kind of underpinning traits. We certainly are not proposing that we're going to stop measuring any of these, and they are really the cornerstones of any breeding program. And so it is optimum number of lambs born and reared to weaning. So things like lamb survival are still critical in our production systems. We need them to be growing despite the environmental challenges. We need ewe longevity, resilience. We need our products, so we need lean, good carcass weights, but also that meat quality aspect. So intramuscular fat and tenderness, milk and pelt quality as well, and wool. So in terms of production traits, are we missing anything that is critical? Natalie's going to scribble. If you've got any other notes, please note them down on your pages and just hand them in at the end. Animal health challenges. I think we could go on for hours about this one actually. I guess the key thing that we are acknowledging is that animal health challenges are going to become bigger, more severe across a wider proportion of New Zealand as we move into the future under that kind of changing climate. And so things like internal parasites, facial eczema, pneumonia. We know where things are sitting for things like internal parasites. We have wormfeck and we have wormfeck gold breeders. We know it's a moderately heritable trait, and so if you are measuring that trait and following the wormfeck protocol and or resilience, then you are making genetic improvement in that trait. Facial eczema is a highly heritable trait at about 0.42, and we have the RamGuard program that is sitting there able to assist breeders in making genetic improvement. Hopefully we're going to be hearing some success about the cell-based testing that will kind of really revolutionise how we can do RamGuard testing, but for now we have the system that we have. The area that is probably the trait that we have less knowledge about, and we have Dr. Catherine McRae in the audience who has been researching this from a genetic angle, is pneumonia. We have been thinking about this trait for a number of years, and any progeny test kill that Catherine can lay her hands on, she is in plant doing pneumonia scoring. Ideally, would love to be able to move to some kind of live animal-based estimate of pneumonia, but it is definitely in the research phase and showing that it is a heritable trait. And so if we can get those measurements, that it is something that could be included within breeding programs. I talk about immune competence in the next slide, but are there any other animal health traits that we're missing? Foot rot.
Fly resistance.
I was going to say fly strike.
Natalie's PhD was on fly strike. So for any of these traits that we're kind of listing that you think are really important that aren't necessarily on these slides, please definitely note them down and kind of say that you think this is the most important trait within your production systems that we need to be considering. Another area that we're just embarking on is an area of immune competence, which is another area that Dr. Catherine McRae from AgResearch is starting the work on. So overseas there has been quite a lot of work looking at breeding for immune competence, particularly in cattle, both in Canada and Australia. And so it's the ability to mount a healthy immune response following exposure to an antigen. There are two different types, cell-mediated and antibody-mediated, and so we have embarked as part of the Future Sheep program that Natalie is running to be able to kind of get some first data on that in a New Zealand context. And so that was doing double skin fold thickness tests, but also collecting blood samples that are going through in vitro testing at the moment at grasslands. And so based on the overseas literature, we hope that we will be able to observe genetic variability in New Zealand sheep for this trait. And so this data set is going to build up over the next couple of years to kind of have that first look at that genetic variability. But one of the things we want to know is what traits does it link to? So we've just listed all our animal health traits within the breeding programs that Natalie has with Capero and Thornycroft. I think quite a lot of those traits, maybe not all of them, are being measured, and so we will be able to link through these immune competence results with those traits, but also things like longevity into the future.
The immune response to specific diseases or...
Yep, we're seeing whether or not. I mean, the first part is, can we see genetic variation in those immune competence traits, and then can we see it that we can kind of, I guess we're wanting to be able to justify that this is a trait that we should be moving forward to, measuring into the future.
So it's the response to the vaccination, and then so think of it, how did you respond to your COVID vaccination? And then the second time you change. Similar, slightly similar, but yeah. It's the ability to mount a defence, and if you can do that quickly without it impacting your production, that's a good thing. But if you do it quickly and you suffer, we don't like that either.
Cool.
Probably the main point is that cattle has been shown. Thank you. And some of the work in cattle, this has been done with cattle in feedlots, so they've shown that animals that have a higher immune response have less incidence of things like respiratory disease. So we're interested in seeing if there's a genetic link to pneumonia, which is hard to measure, or to longevity as well.
Cool. If anybody would like to ask Catherine anything, Catherine more about that over lunch. I'm just conscious we are spending quite a lot of time on our slides because there is so much to discuss on these. So moving on to the physical traits, I think we can just skip through that we've obviously got the different types of wool that we're interested in, whether it's fine wool, strong wool, no wool, whether it's no wool or shedding or hair sheep. The concept of the genetically shorter tails, bare breech, bare belly, moving into things that Scobie's been talking about for a long time in terms of that kind of ethically improved sheep concept. We had reduced stags on the physical traits list there, and also conformation in terms of feet and pasterns there. So I think we've already included...
I'd actually like to ask, so we know with wool, there's whatever conversations around wool, but the fine wool breeders are mainly on Merino Select. So if we actually did more of the fine wool traits in SIL, And then had you been able to compare against everyone else in New Zealand, is that likely, or you'd like to be able to be in both systems, or what? I'm just asking a question. There's quite a few other breeders around that have also trying to fine up their fleece. What are all those traits that we're not doing in SIL?
Heat tolerance. This is one that is really a new cab off the rank in terms of a New Zealand context. So this is the ability to perform under heat and humidity challenges January through April. Within the animals that Natalie has had up at Kapiro, we have observed that the control breed, Romneys, actually would lose weight during that time, whereas some of these other breed mixes that have been being trialled up there have been able to maintain or continue to grow. So our temperate breeds have effectively, because they've been derived from the UK, have effectively undergone no selection for these traits. And so we need to consider whether or not there is genetic variation in the breeds we already have, or do we need to have different breeds. A lot of the breeds that we have in New Zealand that are potentially heat tolerant are more arid derived as opposed to being that subtropically derived. And so do we need to import? But one of the things, and I mentioned cantardins before, we know, or we highly suspect, that those have never been exposed to anything like facial eczema. And so there is a risk for bringing in these overseas breeds that we need to consider those breeding programs to kind of bring together the traits that we actually need. So the work that we've been doing up in Northland, we've just literally, as we speak at Invame, the GPS collars from this summer are being downloaded so that we can look at how individuals have changed their behaviour of those different breed types, the Wiltshires, Damaras, Dorpers, etc., up in Northland over this last summer. We also did put some of the animals through a heat tunnel here at Lincoln, but it is more an acute type of heat stress than chronic. Very quickly they're lifted up to over 40 degrees for a brief period of time. Has anybody had any thoughts or experience on thinking about heat tolerance in their breeding programs?
Not this week.
Trish, would you not argue there's been a level of evolution within the population? Sorry, you'd argue there's been a level of evolution within the populations? Because, you know, that climate change is not only the last 5 years. When we look back the last 20 years or 30 years, there's been an element of that.
Yep. So I definitely, so if we've had kind of natural selection for this trait, and it potentially has, and that's why we kind of need to figure out what our phenotypes are to actually measure it, so that we could start measuring it in different populations to increase those gene pools. So I think I can skip over the methane slide because there's a dedicated session on it at the moment, but it definitely does sit there as a trait. The feed efficiency, so Jason talked very wholeheartedly about this earlier. This is residual feed intake. It's a project that I've been running at Invame for over a decade, coming up a decade now. Very highly heritable trait, but through doing this we can also get that actual feed intake that can be used alongside pack measures that are made at the time. We're definitely observing 20% variation between extremes in terms of this feed efficiency trait. So two animals can be the same weight and growing at the same rate and have 20% difference in their feed intake. Some of the things that we're doing alongside that are doing CT scanning so that we can look at full body composition and how that relates through to all of these production traits. Jason mentioned earlier around the feed intake that it's intake times rate times potentially mouth size or bite volume. We have accelerometer work that we're doing that is specifically looking at the duration and the rate side of things. But for the most recent cohort of animals we've got at Invame, we've actually just CT scanned 80 of their heads to be able to look and see if we can link through anything around head or mouth volume that we could maybe come up with some measures that we could do on the live animal. Conscious of time, and we've got how many minutes? 5. So I'm just going to throw this, we'll start with Hamish, but throwing it open to the floor. What other traits are we thinking about we need into the future?
The biggest problem with RFI is quality of pasture. So it's easy to get RFI, well not easy, easier when you're giving them high ME pellets or grass or silage.
Yep.
But that reality is not that on our farms.
Yep.
And so often during the year, we need sheep that hold their condition
Yep.
with poor quality, and good luck with that.
Yeah, so we actually did a trial at Invermay, thanks COVID, back in 2020, where we put the 2638 ram lambs, split them onto maintenance and maintenance plus ad lib winter feeding, and in those ones that were on maintenance plus, we saw significant genetic variation, that some held their weight and some actually lost weight under that scenario. And so that's where we're wanting to go with things like these accelerometers that we're doing feed intake, to be able to actually get some data at pasture as well, to be able to look at some of this feeding rate and intake and that kind of thing. But definitely, if we had that ability within, and it's the same with what has happened in Northland around looking at that live weights over that mating period, over summer and autumn, if you can actually have those measurements flanking that period of interest, and you can kind of look at the growth rates of those animals and look and see if there's genetic variation, and we know there is. So we just need to figure out a phenotype to capture that and breed for it.
What about trace elements, like things like selenium are an issue? We're either putting it in fertiliser or putting it directly into the animal, but if we weren't, some sheep could handle it, some can't.
Copper.
I'm not sure if I'm letting you put copper down, Natalie.
Looking at the feed efficiency, are you linking that in with internal parasites or cala or anything like that? You know, if you're looking at different weight gains, then is that to do with the actual feed or other things going on?
So the animals that we have are in the Invermay feed intake facility on their alfalfa or lucerne pellets, and so they're not getting any parasite challenge. But any of the animals that we have go through are animals that have all of these other phenotypes measured on them. And so Catherine's noting it down for the 100th time that is something that we need to actually go ahead and pull some of those data sets together, because definitely that feed efficiency is linked to some of these kind of animal health traits and through to that immune competence and what kind of immune response do they mount.
So basically what we're looking for here is a really robust animal that survives in the changing environment. And all of those things that you were thinking about, the health traits, and we want production and performance. But basically we're also looking, that longevity is a real key component of that. These animals that never come on the radar and are highly productive and performing. And we've been coding ewes into SIL for years and years and years, but none of that information gets used. So it's that connection with SIL that you could probably glean some real benefits from information that's sitting in the system but hasn't been used regarding longevity. So just a thought there.
Mm-hmm.
Tricia, I think that all our research, there should be a component of parasite challenge in that research, because the reality is on a farm, those animals have that challenge all the time, and that changes the curve as well. So going forward, we need animals that can do all those things, but under a challenge. And otherwise, some of that research becomes meaningless.
Alrighty. I'm being told to cut from the back row. So if anybody has noted down anything extra that we haven't captured, please feel free to bring it up to Natalie and I. Thank you for your engagement and discussion in this. I think we've also got the pages, although we haven't put them out. If you've got a really strong opinion about any traits, feel free to come up and sticker them so that we know these are the traits. It's a complex future to the ahead of us. We've probably listed 40, 50 traits in this session. As I said earlier, kind of obviously if we spread our genetic gain across a lot of traits, we're going to limit or slow the rate in some of them. But some of these are just simply traits we can't ignore moving into the future, and so we're going to have to figure out a way. So thank you.